So with that being said, I want to welcome everyone to SPARE's webinar on maximizing accessibility and readership through your booking technology. We're very excited to get started. This is a topic that I'm really interested in, and I'm really excited about the panelists that we have. Just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Brendan, and I recently joined SPARE to sort of put on presentations like these. And the reason I was so inspired by SPARE's mission is because I depended on public transit for a large chunk of my life. But I also recognize that as someone who hasn't had to deal with accessibility issues outside of, maybe feeling a little bit uncomfortable in a seat, I'm a very tall person. I've had a lot of privilege in having a very seamless transit experience, but this isn't true for every member of our population. That being said, if we all keep striving for improvement and building an equitable system, there is a potential future we can achieve so everyone can enjoy these privileges in the exact same way with equal accessibility. Joining me today are two panelists who I'm really excited to have to share their experiences both in creating and advocating for a more equitable, inclusive, and accessible transit system. So I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. We'll get started with you, Taylor, if you can provide a little bit of info about yourself and your work with C-TRAN.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brendan. Really happy to be here with you and Dana today to talk about accessibility. This is something that C-TRAN has always been top of mind, obviously, as a public agency, wanting to provide the best mobility that we can for our community, but especially lately, as we've moved more into the area of employing different technology platforms and making sure that we are bringing all of our riders along with us. C-TRAN is a regional transit agency. We provide urban and rural fixed route and demand response service in the Clark County, Washington area, including service into Portland, Oregon, just across the river. Like many agencies over the last few years, C-TRAN has seen some pretty dramatic changes in ridership patterns, notably our express routes, which lost 80 to 90% of our typical daily ridership. But we also noticed that there were a number of areas that held really strong during that time, both on fixed route and demand response. And those were to places like essential services, grocery stores, schools, similar destinations that had never had particularly high ridership, but were always stable and really critical for that reason. And those patterns really prompted us to look more deeply into who was riding, why those services were important to them, and helping us understand more of what we could do to make sure that the service we're providing is accessible from both a onboard and before they get on the trip standpoint.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm excited to be digging more into some of those learnings that you had and what sort of prompted you to make some of the changes that you've made over this last year and a bit. And then for you, Dana, we'd love to hear a bit more about yourself and meeting the challenge and how it's working with transit organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me this morning or afternoon. So my name is Dana Barton, and I am the director of Meeting the Challenge. We are an accessibility consulting firm, and we work mainly with state and local governments on helping them implement self-evaluation and transition plans, which is a requirement for Title II entities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And a self-evaluation and transition plan helps you kind of evaluate what you have going on, whether it's your programs you offer, services, activities, as well as your physical locations, figure out what your baseline is, and then what you need to do to remediate any barriers that might exclude individuals with disabilities. And so when we're working with these municipalities, we're working a lot with transit, whether it be the bus stop or train station to how someone might access information. And just as Taylor mentioned, over the last 2.5 years, we've seen an incredible shift of people accessing services online when we were all sent home and had to figure out how to even access a city council meeting or a class at school, etc. And very quickly learned that a lot of online material was not accessible. And what we're seeing in the United States from the Department of Justice is that they are considering any kind of digital platform, whether it's website, social media, digital kiosk, etc., that is an extension of your brick and mortar and an extension of your program services and activities. And so now more than ever, it is important to make sure that you're looking at accessibility from all angles so that you can provide equal access to all sorts of individuals. So that cover it, Brendan?
Yeah, I think that was a fantastic introduction.
Perfect.
And yeah, if there's anything that we can take from these last 2 years, I hope it's learnings, just lots of learnings, because within learning always comes improvement of some kind. But on that note, we can jump into the subject matter we have planned for today. One of the reasons we're putting on this presentation is to remind everyone that different riders are going to have very different needs, as we talked about in our introductions. Sometimes the things that are really of a great convenience for some in the population can actually end up being a big obstacle for others. So Dana, I want to start by asking you about some of what we might consider to be unseen accessibility issues, whether it's something that impacts the ride or their ability to actually book the ride in the first place.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of terms that go around about individuals with disabilities. Some people say, you know, visible disabilities versus invisible disabilities. There's all sorts of different things you can think about. But when you're looking at accessibility, like in the digital space, specifically to websites, social media, etc., a lot of times we don't think about things like color on a map. And so for an individual who's colorblind, that you're not going to be able to look at and see that they have a disability, if you're only marking your map and the different routes that you have in different colors, you're unintentionally screening out or making your content inaccessible for individuals with disabilities. So things like font size, the type of font you use, different colors. If you're going to use different colors, that's great, but also have different dashed or dotted lines, etc. Also, a lot of individuals use screen readers or can't access a website with a mouse. And so needing to be able to scroll through with a keyboard is important. And, you know, I find when I'm talking to content creators for websites that often they have no idea what they need to do kind of behind the scenes in order to make things accessible for all sorts of individuals. And, you know, moreover, even writing things in plain language so that individuals can understand maybe how to book a ticket or find what they need to online, or where to go when they get to a station and they need to access a kiosk. Putting that in plain language can really help everyone. So maybe a person with an intellectual disability as well. So those are some of the unseen needs that we see and we are talking about with our clients when we talk about effective communication and what that looks like for different mediums.
With some of these examples that you're providing, I'm kind of curious, because it doesn't just pertain to the transit industry, but really to all industry on large. Why do you think some of these blockers get forgotten about as people start to scale their operations?
Sure. There's a couple of different reasons. I think the first is that you don't know what you don't know. And so until you've been in someone else's situation or had a family member who's needed something, oftentimes you don't see these as barriers because you go about your day and you're able to use transit the way that you want to use transit, and you don't think about some of these barriers. So I think that's one reason. I also think that as technology is advancing so quickly, some things kind of get lost in translation. So if your website or your digital platform isn't built from the beginning with accessibility in mind, and you're allowing 10 different people in your organization to be content creators and upload things to the website, and you don't have really good brand guidelines, et cetera, and some QA, quality control in there, oftentimes things can get missed. So I think it does come down to training. Another thing is, I think maybe naturally we look to a younger generation to make sure that our content and our digital platforms are up to date. Even last night, my 13-year-old son showed me how to do something that I should have known how to do. I was like, well, gosh, now I'm old. But we look to the younger generation. We assume that they know how to do everything, but maybe they haven't learned about the artificial intelligence or the accessibility features that vary from an Apple platform to an Android platform, or whatever that looks like. And so we can't just assume the person in charge of this knows what's going on. We really, I think, need to focus on training and making sure that they are looking at that from the earliest stages of creating content.
I totally agree. And I think there's this, once the ball gets rolling and that momentum is there, you just kind of keep building. And the further that you build, the further you get into the journey, the more of a lift it requires to catch everything all up. I remember at my last job, we had something like 600 web pages across all of our content. And then all of a sudden we had this movement, we need to make this accessible. And we had to make every single web page accessible. So starting at the start is a really important step, but it doesn't mean that it's ever too late to start making these changes.
That's right.
So moving over to you, Taylor, I understand that C-TRAN launched its microtransit program in January 2022. Can you tell us a little bit about the booking options that are currently available to your riders?
Absolutely. Yeah, C-TRAN launched the Current, which is our microtransit service, earlier this year. And it was a really exciting service for us to launch, somewhat born out of a historically underperforming service for a number of reasons. And we really wanted to help riders connect with our fixed route and with our C-Van paratransit service. And I think Dana made a lot of really great points in her earlier response that, we were building out a new service and there were some challenges for us along the way in terms of how this operates within our agency, but that can't be an excuse for not having the appropriate accessibility within that platform so that people can actually access and use the service that we're putting out there. And so as we were building out, one thing we were hearing continuously during both operation of our previous service and outreach for the Current was that we needed to significantly reduce barriers to entry for accessing the service. And we realized that one of the reasons our previous service wasn't performing well was that people didn't know how to access it. The information to be able to get in touch with us wasn't there. We had one option for booking, and it was really challenging to understand, especially as a new user, how to go about accessing that in order to book a trip. And because of all of that, we knew that for the Current, we needed a more intuitive platform, and we needed to do a much better job about putting information in front of our riders in a format that was consumable for them, however that may be. And so today, riders can book a trip on the Current on a mobile application, which is how most of our riders book today. But they can also use a web booking platform at ridethecurrent.com. They can call our customer service representatives, or they can walk up to one of our vehicles at a transit center or when it's parked on the street and book a trip right then directly with one of our operators. And extending that availability of information has been really important to us. And we've tried to build out those resources as much as possible. And some of the additional ways that we've done that has been with integrations like with Transit app, which has really served as a critical tool to help our riders plan trips that allow them to connect with our greater fixed route network and even with other regional providers, because we can't just assume that people are going to be making a trip on our network only. We wanted to try to do the best that we could to help extend that trip planning and information realm as much as possible.
And what I'm hearing in your response that I find so powerful is that it's about options that meet people where they're most comfortable being met, whether that's on a smartphone, on a computer, or just interacting with an operator. So just as a follow-up to that, was there anything that you assumed about the demographics you were going to be serving? And was that in any way an influence on how you shaped your operations?
It absolutely was. And I'll say that we did make some initial assumptions about the people that were writing our service, but we really wanted to take steps to move beyond just making an assumption and to really getting a better understanding about who was writing the service. So we went to in-person outreach with the community. We took really deliberate steps with our community advisory committee. And we really relied on some of our local partnerships with organizations like the Washington State School for the Blind and the Washington State School for the Deaf to help us get a better understanding of anyone that may be using our service and exactly how we might meet their needs in doing so, because we know that they're all using it for different reasons and in different ways. And at a baseline, we knew that a number of folks really relied on our service for years back, and in some cases it's their only form of mobility. And we knew that some of those folks liked our previous service because it was reliable for them and worked well for them, but that didn't necessarily translate to everyone. But we knew that we had to make sure that we were both bringing our pre-existing riders along with us as we were making this transition to a new, more technology-based platform. And so a few months into service now, we've heard that really all of the booking platforms that we have available are critical services and critical tools for people to be able to both get information about their trips in terms of booking them, managing their profile, but also in terms of getting real-time updates and getting information about their upcoming trip. And we've really extended that as we could, both into before the trip and onboard the vehicle with lift equipped vehicles and bike rack equipped vehicles. As I mentioned, a number of booking platforms, which really thankfully to you all at Spare are adaptive and translatable. And that's been really critical for us to have as we're continuing outreach into our especially new rider bases at this point. We've also looked to bring on a greater availability of travel training for our potential riders to make sure that folks are able to make the trip that works for them. And we've gone into new ADA language assistance and mobility training for our operators and our customer service representatives as well, really to just ensure that someone is having a consistent and accessible experience regardless of how they're booking or how they're using the service.
I love that, the consistent and accessible. I think that's so important, having that consistency of experience that someone can rely on. It's what really turns a one-time rider into someone who's depending on your service and using it as their first option. Now, another case to consider beyond those who live with accessibility challenges are maybe lower income individuals who may not have smartphones or data plans. In fact, we actually have a data scientist in-house at Spare named Jerome, and he found that riders with disabilities actually skew towards lower income brackets. So I'm going to post that study in the chat now. I highly recommend you check it out on your own time. There's a lot of valuable information in there. But typically, this means that riders with accessibility issues need to plan ahead and will depend on call centers to get their trips set out for them if you don't give them that other option that is working for them. So Taylor, you've kind of already answered some of this question in some of your earlier response, but just to reiterate, with how you define some of the demographics you were servicing earlier, what has been some of the feedback you've received about your operations, your accessibility options, and what have been some of the big learnings you've had about the wants and the needs of your riders?
Yeah, we were pretty fortunate to really have a nice foundation of knowledge leading into the launch of this service of kind of what not to do in order to make our service accessible. And so that was a great place for us to start. But as I mentioned, we were really relying on outreach and our interaction with riders today to make sure that we were shaping our operations and our rider experience, both when booking the service and on board. And I think you made a really critical point there, which is that people do need a variety of platforms depending on how what may be accessible to them and what they may need to be doing from a trip booking standpoint. And that's one of the reasons that, for instance, we have a variety of booking periods available. Someone can book a trip on the current up to 2 days in advance, or they can book a trip on demand. We know that there's a breadth of trip purposes that need to be met, and we wanted to help provide some ability to have a trip available when you need it, because not all trips are able to be planned in advance, and that on demand right now trip is really critical at times. But it's also really important to be able to know that you're going to be able to get to your doctor's appointment on time when you know that in advance, or you're going to be able to make your flight if you're connecting to one of our other routes. So having those available was really important from an operational standpoint. But we've also heard a lot about the actual booking and profile management experience on the platform. And a great example of that I think we've heard recently is that we know we have some folks who may not manage their own trips on a daily basis. They may have a family member or a caregiver that does that for them, but they are able to have their caregiver or family member manage their trips and book their profile on the web booking platform that we have available, while that rider may have the mobile application on their phone. And with that, the caregiver is able to create their trips, manage, cancel, make changes as needed. But that rider can really importantly get real-time updates about the trip, if it might be delayed by a minute or two, or where the vehicle is in relation to them. And that's been, I think, really critical and a huge advantage to a number of our riders based on what they've had in the past and in terms of the information that's available to them.
Yeah, and I think opening up those channels for feedback are so important. And I think that it's one of the reasons why an organization like Meeting the Challenge is so important in terms of getting that feedback and that insight. So Dana, you work with a wide range of transit operations, but you work beyond that as well. I know you've worked with parks and other facilities. So I'm curious, what's some of the consistent feedback that you may be providing to these places?
Well, definitely the importance of communication is really important. And I know Taylor's talked about that, and I've talked about that. And another thing that I think is really important is the difference between equality and equity. And equality is where we're giving everyone the same. Everyone gets the same. Everyone gets the same set of stairs to get into a building, or the same routes, or same vehicle. Where equity is more about giving everyone the same opportunity to participate. And the Americans with Disabilities Act really is about that equity and integrating individuals with disabilities into everyday mainstream life. And if I'm not talking about community and what that means for the community, I'm doing a disservice to the municipalities that I'm working with. So whether it be making sure that we have accessible playgrounds and parks that are dispersed equitably across a community, but also listening to the feedback of the people who live there and who might use those playgrounds and parks, or listening to the feedback of an individual who's using a transit system. That public outreach, that public input piece is critical. Engaging with those who represent people with disabilities and individuals with disabilities as you're working to plan, expand services, etc., is really, really, really important. And so we're having to have that conversation with every community that we work with, I guess is probably what I would say to that.
And I'm so glad that you took the opportunity to define equality versus equity. I think that's such an important differentiation to make, where one is giving everybody the same service, but the other is giving people the same service so they have equal opportunity. It's such an important distinction. But both of you have talked about the importance of communication when it comes to accessibility and making changes to systems. So when taking in that feedback and making changes to your system, there are multiple people that need to stay informed. There's those that are within an organization, whether it's the operators or the drivers, but there's also keeping your riders up to date to ensure that they can adapt to a change in the process. So Taylor, can you start by sharing how you've approached this problem of keeping everyone informed?
Yeah, it's been I would say a learning process for us. This is a new service, and making changes to a new service, however inconsequential or small they may seem from a cubicle, can have wide-ranging impacts to the system, both from the operator standpoint and the rider standpoint. So it's been really important for us to start documenting and tracking the changes that we're making as we are looking to put them in, but also ensuring that we're getting feedback about those changes before we do so. And one of the great things about this new service and microtransit in general for us has been that it allows a more tailored experience when we are interacting with people in the public and on board. It allows us the opportunity to collect feedback within the application platform, but we can also collect feedback on board and connect with riders in the way that makes the most sense for them from a feedback standpoint, not necessarily in terms of just generally accessing the system. So working in all of those different environments has let us go a lot farther in terms of collecting feedback on any potential changes and making sure that we are hearing the voices of riders that are on the system today, and understanding why there may be people that would like to be on the system today but are not.
And Dana, can you add anything from the standpoint of, when you're educating riders, how you can ensure that message is being received, but is also accessible and really can be taken in by everybody who needs it?
Absolutely. So we've touched on it, but I think having multiple forms or means to collect feedback is really important. And so if you have an operator who is receiving feedback verbally, do they know what to do with that feedback, or do they just tuck it away and go home for the night and, cool, someone told me that? And have you trained your staff on how to relay that information to make systems changes within your system? If you're making a quick change and you're only putting it out on social media, what does that look like? If you're, I can give you an example of a transit system here in Colorado, and they did a really cool video on how to get your fare on your smartphone. And I know they thought they were doing a great thing by not having any voiceover in it. It was just reading or just text on the video. But they didn't think about an individual who was blind, who also needs to know, and they were completely excluded from that video and didn't get that information. So you have to think about it, I think, from different disabilities. What does this communication look like for a person who's visually impaired? What does this communication look like for a person who's deaf? What does this communication look like for a person with a physical disability, et cetera? So I think that would be one way to make sure that you're getting that feedback. And then the second thing I would say is I work with municipalities, but also private businesses. And I hear this from private business more, but they'll say, I don't have any customers with disabilities. And I have to say, well, that's because there's 4 stairs to get into your location, and they can't get into your location, or the door's not wide enough. So of course you don't have any customers with disabilities. They can't access your services. And so again, going back and reaching out to organizations and individuals with disabilities, whether it's an independent living center, as Taylor mentioned, the School for the Deaf and Blind, et cetera, and making sure you're getting consumer feedback. And if you're not getting a certain segment of the population that you would expect to get, a certain demographic, if you see that missing, go to that demographic and ask them, why aren't they using your services? There's a reason that likely you're going to be able to find a solution to.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point there, which is no matter what you think you know about the demographics of the people using the service, there's always going to be that demographic of the people who aren't using the service, and you don't know what that blocker is going to be there. And I think that's a perfect segue into our next topic. So I've titled this slide, "A World Inaccessible to Some is an Inaccessible World." And I remember hearing that from one of the first customers of Spare that I spoke to about how they were designing their transit program. And it really resonated with me because I've had family and friends who struggle with certain barriers of accessibility. And it's one of those things that makes me realize how much I take for granted. But the work that we're all doing, we can continue to do every day to break down those barriers and make a world where the things that I might take for granted can actually really be everybody's reality. So I'd love to hear some closing thoughts from both of our panelists today. Just why is continuing to improve the accessibility of transit services important, and what does the future potentially look like for accessible transit? And I don't know which one of you would prefer to launch us off on that topic there.
I'd be happy to.
Sure.
I think for us, what it really is it's listening and experiencing. As an agency, there's a lot of services that we can provide and push out the door, but they're not going to be services that meet our riders' needs if we don't know how those services actually perform out in the world. And we know that we had some feedback forms, if you want to call them that were designed for certain people within our agency or certain members of the public, and we realized quickly that those weren't going to cut it here, and that we needed to do something that was more in depth to really round out the opportunities that this new service presented to us. And so now we are everyone at the agency now is writing service on a monthly basis and recording their experience, which includes our micro transit service. And we're having regular meetings with our operators and our dispatchers to really solidify those feedback channels and make sure that the really valuable experience that's coming in regularly gets communicated on a regular basis, so that we can continue to bring that in and actually be productive in the information that we're making available and putting out. And I think that really in the long run, it's going to be making as much information as we can available to our riders, so that they are able to make informed decisions and have their freedom of mobility to make choices that work for them, and not feel limited by the services that we provide, but really feel empowered by the services that we provide.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Dana, do you have any thoughts as well on the future of transit and accessibility?
Absolutely. So, I could talk about this for a long time, for hours, but when I think about, it kind of goes back to one of the questions you asked earlier, but why are these systems created without accessibility in mind? And something positive that I've seen over the last few years is when I'm examining what I call my media diet, and what I'm taking in, the individuals that I'm talking to, shows that I'm watching, movies that I'm seeing a lot more inclusivity towards individuals with disabilities. And so there's not, I'm noticing there's not as much of a stigma around that. But you also mentioned, and you put in the chat, the study that individuals with disabilities are generally fall more into poverty. And that's a truth. And so I think when we look at the future of accessible transit, we also have to look at our workforce. And I know this is kind of like tangential, but if someone can't get to work, then they don't have an opportunity to get themselves out of poverty. And we then we don't have people that we're sitting next to ask questions. So, Taylor mentioned their staff is writing, using their services, once a month, but does that look different for an individual with a disability versus an able-bodied individual? If we've only hired individuals who are able-bodied, are we still not collecting the feedback that we need? How can we bring people with disabilities into the workplace as well and integrate them? And so, I think the future of an accessible world looks like us integrating people the best with disabilities the best we can into our workplace, into our friend group, into our places of worship, et cetera. And so I would just, I'll get off my soapbox, but I would just encourage everyone to look at how are you interacting with individuals with disabilities in your everyday life, and what does that look like, and where have you seen challenges, and where can you help to make a difference?
Again, thank you so much, both of you, for those contributions, because there was a common theme across both of your answers that I thought was so important, which is listening. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we can operate from our own places of assumptions and our own places of learning, but if we're not listening, we may be omitting some piece of information that is integral to building something that is more accessible. And I really, really hope that for the people who are in attendance today, or maybe watching a recording of this later down the line, if you do take anything from this presentation, it's to listen to the people that you may not otherwise have that opportunity to, and open up that feedback. Looking at some of the poll results, and thank you again to everybody who answered the poll. It's just 2 questions about the confidence in the accessibility of your website and the accessibility of your booking platform. And there's quite a few responses where it's somewhat confident or unsure or somewhat unconfident. You can go out and try and find the people who you're trying to meet, who you're trying to provide this service to, and start asking those questions to try and evaluate where there may be a gap in your own knowledge. And I think that's just that importance of listening. So again, thank you to both of our panelists for their contributions. It's going to bring us to the Q&A section. I do have a couple of questions that I cut for time, so we can consider it the director's cut if I do actually get to ask those. But again, I encourage anybody who's in attendance, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A. If you have any trouble finding the Q&A section, you can also just drop it in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm just going to fire a question Dana's way, if you don't mind. What's a good starting point when it comes to optimizing your digital accessibility? Is there like a first step that you recommend people taking?
Absolutely. So the way, as there's several steps. So a tool, there's several tools online that you can use. WebAIM works with the World Wide Web Consortium, WC3, and internationally, they've come together to create a set of standards for digital accessibility across countries, et cetera. And they call it the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, depending on where you are. My understanding is that a new version of WCAG is coming out in September. That will be version 2.2. But WebAIM is a company that has a tool called Wave, and you can just find that in your search browser, and you can actually put your URL into that on their website, and it will show you all the errors that you have on your page. It'll show you where headings are wrong, et cetera. So when I'm working with a client and we're doing a digital audit, we have a person in the background who's way smarter than I am, who knows how to do all the coding things and all the things that I can't do, and maybe some of you can't do either. And he runs this full audit and shows us all these things. But simultaneously, I have 4 user testers, a person who's blind, a person with a macular degeneration, a person who's deaf, and a person with cerebral palsy who can't use a mouse. And I give them a bunch of tasks. Go find this on the website, book a trip, etc. Figure out, how much it costs to get from point A to point B. And we marry their feedback with what's on the back end. Because just having a beautifully coded back end doesn't mean that it's user friendly. And so I guess there's not one step, Brendan, it's 2. It's kind of that technical audit, but also a user tester audit, which I think is critical and goes back to listening to the people who are using your service.
Yeah, and I remember doing some stats courses where the tale was always, data is sort of the spine that you can build a story on. So you really need to start actually talking to people and getting them to try things out to make sure that the data corroborates what you actually know. So I actually did put a link in the chat to the Wave accessibility evaluation tool. So I highly encourage anybody who has access to that to give your web page a quick look, and yeah, do exactly as Dana suggested. Try to find the people who may have those issues accessing, doing certain tasks on your website, and seeing if that corroborates the information that you're being provided.
Can I add one more thing about that?
Yeah, of course, please.
Okay. I've seen a lot of companies come out recently that say you can use this plugin, and with 1 line of code will make your entire website accessible. I struggle with that as a policy or a practice within an organization, because I don't believe 1 line of code can make sure that the alt text on an image that you have on your website, 1 line of code, the AI is not good enough yet to accurately describe an image or something like that. So I would be wary of using, I think those tools are great as a tool, but they're not the end all be all. Now I'm accessible. The content creator is so important in this, puzzle that we're trying to put together.
Yeah, and I think it's a general rule of thumb, whenever a piece of technology promises the entire sky, it's not going to do it very. Yeah.
If I can just add one piece on that, I think from our end and probably from a lot of public agencies, our fear in this realm is failure and recognition of failure. And sometimes, unfortunately, the recognition or having someone know that you fail outweighs the desire to actually implement that change. And that's a really difficult barrier for a lot of folks. And I know that it's a slow barrier. Admittedly, it is for us, but it's something that's really important for us to recognize moving forward, is that failing on something like accessibility right now is not as bad as not recognizing it or not being willing to recognize it and make those changes.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. I think another interesting sort of aspect to that is that fear of failure can kind of create failure in itself, where it's that failure of taking action, right? So yeah, I think it's important to not be dictated by that fear of failure. There's other things to be concerned about when it comes to that. And in addition to that, Taylor, I'm just kind of curious, you mentioned working with a couple of different organizations that represented people living with deafness or living with blindness. How did C-TRAN sort of start those conversations, get in contact, and start collaborating in that way?
Well, I'll say that we have the really fortunate luck of having them located in our service area. So we are able to have some pretty close interactions with them because of that. But I think beyond that, they're so willing to and have a huge desire to have input that the hardest part is just us reaching out to them. I can think of a number of organizations that are really begging to have input, that we just need to kind of recognize and provide a voice to. And, you know, we have a community advisory committee that's been really great to help open some of those channels, because they also have some great connections that we can begin to make and bring in. But at the baseline, it's really kind of just making the connection and showing the agency desire for improvement, and showing not only that you're looking to them so that you can say that you've reached out to them, but also valuing and implementing or internalizing the feedback that they provide.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not like it can be a one-time thing. Like it needs to be that constant engagement, right?
Absolutely.
And then also just kind of building off of some of these questions, like going back to, launching the microtransit program earlier this year. One thing that I'm kind of curious about is that was probably a big change to your transit system. Were there any steps that you needed to take to sort of educate people about that change, how they could prepare for it, or, adapt to it a little bit more easily?
Yeah, we of course use a lot of our typical outreach platforms with, in-person outreach where we have network services, but it was also really important for us to get on the ground and be in person with a lot of the places that we are serving with our microtransit, because it's intended in large part for us to help fill service gaps in places that are really challenging to serve from a fixed route standpoint, and provide a lot more tailored experience for riders with different mobility levels, or with different needs from an origin and destination standpoint. So it was really about getting on the ground for us, and going to farmers markets, going to schools, going to local community gatherings or neighborhood groups to make sure that we were getting the word out about this service. And now that it's out there, we have some great new options as far as pushing out information within the application itself and collecting feedback in that way. But even now, it's still really important for us to get on the ground and make sure that our information and info about our services in the hands of people that can be passed along.
Yeah, and that in-person interaction can sometimes be like the best way to actually get it across, because people can actually adapt to the situation, whereas a piece of technology is kind of built up to do one specific thing. So once somebody comes in who has different needs, it can't really adapt to that situation, whereas a person typically can. We are resilient people. Now, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. I'll just put it out there one more time. If you do have any questions, please drop them in either the Q&A or the chat. If there is anything that you're curious about, I think there's a wealth of knowledge and experience on this panel that could provide some insight on anything you're curious about on this topic. And I'll just give it like a bit more time. Not seeing any activity. Well, if we don't have any questions, I'm more than happy to give everyone back a little bit of their time today. But before I do, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to spend on this topic. It is something that is incredibly important, and I think just by being a part and listening and trying to take in some of this information, yeah, hopefully there is a lot of learning that we can all do, a lot of listening that we can start doing from here on out, and trying to implement some changes that can really make a positive impact on riders everywhere and making transit more accessible. And thank you again so much to both of our panelists for joining us today. Your contributions were extremely valued, and we're so happy to have you. With all that being said, I will close it off here, and I hope for everyone in the audience that you'll join us for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.